What would it be like to witness the heartbreaking moment when a son takes the life of the very man who raised him? Today, we will dive deep into a scandal almost too shocking to believe. Rick Harrison from Pawn Stars has stunned the world by confessing in court to killing his father, Richard "Old Man" Harrison. What led to this brutal act? Let's uncover the truth behind these unbelievable revelations. As the dark secrets of the gold and silver pawn shop come to light, the facade of a perfect family has been shattered. Rick Harrison admitted, under oath, that he was responsible for his father's death. When the mask was stripped away, what remained was a story of betrayal, ambition, and heartache. What could have driven Rick to commit such a tragic and brutal act? Today, we will explore the harrowing events that led to this devastating downfall. Rick's confession not only shocked the courtroom, but also destroyed the once proud legacy of a family business known around the world. Leave a comment with the number 1 if you think this story is worth reflecting on, and share your thoughts about why Rick might have made such choices. Leave a comment with the number 0 if you are in disbelief and want to discuss how the legacy of this television legend unraveled. Don't forget to like, share, and leave your opinion below. At the center of it all sat Rick Harrison, the once beloved star of Pawn Stars, a man millions of Americans had come to trust. His face was pale, his usually sharp eyes dulled, almost hollow. He adjusted the microphone in front of him with a trembling hand, his wedding ring clinking softly against the metal. The room was so silent that even the scuff of a shoe on the floor seemed deafening. "My name is Rick Harrison," he began, voice cracking ever so slightly. "I'm here to tell the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rick's life had always played out like a classic American dream. A high school dropout who, alongside his father, Richard "Old Man" Harrison, built the gold and silver pawn shop into a global brand. The pawn shop on South Las Vegas Boulevard wasn't just a store anymore. It was a symbol, a shrine to hustle, grit, and family loyalty. But as Rick spoke, the perfect image crumbled. "My father was the first," Rick said, each word dropping heavily into the courtroom like a stone in water. "I killed him." Gasps erupted, and the judge rapped his gavel sharply, demanding order. But there was no way to fully contain the shock that pulsed through the room like an electric current. Across the courtroom, sitting quietly among the crowd, was a figure few recognized immediately. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit and aviator sunglasses, Sylvester Stallone watched Rick with a grim expression. To the world, Stallone was the action hero, the face behind Rocky and Rambo. But today, he was just another old friend mourning the death of a man he once called brother. Few knew that Richard Harrison and Stallone had shared a bond forged decades earlier during their time in the U.S. Navy. Long before fame or fortune touched either man, Richard had been a mentor of sorts to the younger Stallone, teaching him not just how to endure, but how to lead. That bond had never broken, not even when life pulled them in different directions. So when Stallone heard about Richard's sudden passing, he knew something didn't sit right. At the funeral service, held at the Palm Mortuary on Southeastern Avenue, Stallone noticed the strained faces of Richard's other children, Joseph, Christopher, and Sherry. The air was thick with something unsaid, a quiet tension lurking beneath the surface of the polite condolences and forced smiles. Later that evening, over whiskey at a quiet booth in the Golden Nugget, Stallone confided to an old Navy buddy, "Something's off, Johnny." Richie was a hard bastard, but he was fair. He wouldn't just cut out his own kids. Johnny, who had served under Richard and knew the Harrison family dynamics well, nodded grimly. "You think Rick pulled something?" Stallone didn't answer immediately. He just stared down into his glass, the golden liquid trembling slightly in his hand. The first clue came days later when Stallone managed to get his hands on a copy of Richard's final will. It had been heavily amended only months before his death, slashing out provisions that once gave sizable portions to his other children and concentrating everything, millions in property, business interests, and cash, solely into Rick's name. Richard, Stallone knew, would never have done that in his right mind. It was then that Stallone decided he couldn't sit back and watch. He leveraged his considerable network, former military contacts, old Vegas friends, even a few discreet connections in local law enforcement. Together, they began pulling at the seams of Rick's story. Whispers turned into leads. A hospice nurse who had cared for Richard during his final weeks quietly admitted that Rick often insisted on managing Richard's medications himself. Another staff member at the pawn shop confessed to seeing heated arguments between Rick and his father in the back office. Arguments that stopped abruptly when the cameras were rolling. Bit by bit, a darker picture began to emerge. Rick Harrison, desperate for control, resentful of being kept in his father's shadow, even after years of success, had manipulated a dying man into handing over everything. Still, Stallone knew suspicion wasn't enough. If justice was going to be served, it needed evidence. Hard, irrefutable proof. That proof came in the form of a set of emails Stallone's team uncovered. Correspondence between Rick and the pawn shop's corporate lawyer hinted at planned changes to the trust long before Richard's health took a serious downturn. There were drafts, meeting notes, even quiet financial transactions, shifting ownership of certain assets to shell companies Rick controlled. It was damning. Meanwhile, Rick continued to maintain his public persona. In television appearances and interviews, he mourned his father with practiced solemnity, spinning tales of their close bond, their mutual respect. Fans flooded the gold and silver pawn shop, leaving flowers and handwritten notes at the door. Business boomed. But behind closed doors, detectives were quietly building a case. It took nearly a year to bring everything together. Stallone remained in the background, careful never to reveal his hand too early. It wasn't about vengeance for him. It was about honoring a promise he had made long ago, to stand by the men who had stood by him. When the arrest finally came, it rocked Las Vegas to its core. And now, here, in a sterile courtroom, surrounded by flashing cameras and a nation's curiosity, Rick Harrison was tearing down his own empire with nothing more than a few raw, broken words. "My father trusted me," Rick said, his voice hollow. "And I let that trust destroy me." The judge called a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied in a rush of murmurs and questions. Stallone remained seated, staring straight ahead, his weathered face unmoving. He wasn't there for spectacle. He was there because of loyalty. To a man who had once taught a young, scared kid from Hell's Kitchen how to survive a world that didn't give second chances. As the doors swung open and the desert sun poured into the marble halls, Stallone rose from his seat, the leather soles of his shoes whispering against the floor. He tucked his sunglasses into his pocket and pulled a worn Navy medallion from inside his jacket. It had been Richard's once, a gift given long ago in a different lifetime. Clutching it tightly, Stallone stepped out into the heat of the Vegas afternoon, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. As Rick sat slumped in his chair, the courtroom lights seeming somehow dimmer than before, a heavy silence descended over the room. The recess offered little reprieve. Even in the hallways, hushed voices carried shock and disbelief, the kind of stunned murmurs that linger when an American icon falls from grace. Outside the courthouse, news trucks lined Bridger Avenue, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters rehearsing their lines under the blazing Las Vegas sun, eager to feed the endless appetite for scandal. But inside, amid the cold marble and oak benches, the real reckoning was underway. Rick's attorneys, visibly shaken, huddled near him, whispering furiously. But Rick barely acknowledged them. His shoulders sagged, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if holding on to the last shreds of the man he used to be. When the proceedings resumed, the prosecution wasted no time. They called Detective Laura Martinez to the stand, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Her testimony was methodical, clinical, but devastating. She detailed the timeline that Stallone's team had helped piece together. The months leading up to Richard Harrison's death, marked by suspicious financial activities, sudden amendments to the family trust, and most damningly, the isolation of Richard from nearly all his relatives. Surveillance footage was introduced, grainy but clear enough to show Rick escorting notaries and attorneys into his father's home on multiple occasions. Witnesses spoke of Richard's deteriorating mental state, describing a proud man reduced to confusion and frailty, easily manipulated by those he trusted most. The courtroom listened in stony silence as an audio clip was played, recorded secretly by a hospice nurse. In it, Richard's voice, weak but unmistakable, questioned why he hadn't seen his other children in weeks, expressing fear that something wasn't right. The jury sat rigid, their faces unreadable, but their tension palpable. Rick's defense tried to argue that Richard was lucid when he signed the new documents, but the weight of evidence crushed any hope of casting doubt. Stallone's efforts, quiet and calculated, had made it nearly impossible for Rick to hide behind technicalities. As the prosecution built their case, they painted a portrait of a man trapped by his own ambition, a son whose desperate need for control had overtaken the very values his father had tried to instill in him. Richard Harrison had taught Rick about resilience, loyalty, and honor, qualities forged during endless drills on naval bases and long shifts running the pawn shop. Yet somewhere along the way, those lessons had curdled into resentment. Rick, it seemed, could not forgive the old man for never stepping aside, never giving him the full reins of the empire he had helped build. Instead of carving his own path, Rick had chosen to take the throne by force. Meanwhile, Stallone remained a silent sentinel. He sat through every grueling detail, his jaw set, his gaze unwavering. Though the press speculated about his presence, he refused interviews, turning down every request with a simple shake of the head. For him, it wasn't about headlines. It was about respect. Richard had been a mentor, a brother in arms when they both wore the Navy's colors, and Stallone had not forgotten the code they had lived by, a code Rick had shattered. As the trial progressed, the impact of Rick's confession began to ripple outward. Tourists stopped visiting the gold and silver pawn shop. Vendors canceled merchandise contracts. The History Channel scrubbed promotional material featuring Rick's image. Online forums exploded with outrage, and old fans expressed their heartbreak in comments filled with disbelief and betrayal. Las Vegas, a city built on second chances and reinvention, seemed almost embarrassed by its fallen son. On the fourth day of the trial, Rick finally took the stand again. This time, there were no cameras allowed inside. The judge had ordered the testimony closed to media to preserve the dignity of what had already become a public spectacle. But those inside the courtroom would never forget what they witnessed. Rick's voice, once commanding and smooth, was raw and unguarded as he spoke of his final night with Richard. He described sitting in the dim living room of his father's modest home off West Charleston Boulevard, the television flickering silently in the background. Richard had been tired, more confused than usual, struggling even to remember the names of his grandchildren. Rick recounted bringing his father a glass of water and the night's medication, adjusting the old man's blanket before sitting beside him. "I just sat there," Rick whispered hoarsely. "I watched him breathe, slow and shallow, and I thought, he's never going to let go. I'm never going to be more than his shadow." Tears welled in his eyes, but didn't fall. He admitted crushing additional sedatives into Richard's medicine that night, enough to ensure he wouldn't wake again. "I told myself it was mercy," Rick said, his voice breaking. "I told myself it was love. But the truth is, it was about me, about needing to be free." The silence that followed was absolute. When Rick stepped down from the witness stand, he no longer looked like the sharp, witty businessman viewers had known. He looked like a man utterly broken by the weight of his own sins. As proceedings drew toward their close, the defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Rick was not a monster, but a son crushed by impossible expectations. They presented evidence of Rick's long struggle with depression, his counseling records, his deteriorating relationship with his family. But the prosecution remained firm. Ambition did not excuse betrayal. Greed could not be justified by pain. Throughout it all, Stallone sat unmoving, a silent witness to the crumbling of a legacy he had once admired. When the time came for closing arguments, the prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke not just of law, but of trust, the sacred bond between father and son. "Richard Harrison built something out of nothing," she said. "He taught his son about honor, hard work, and family. And when he was at his weakest, he was betrayed by the very person he loved most." As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, heavy with a kind of collective mourning. Outside, the desert heat pressed down mercilessly, but the courthouse steps remained crowded with reporters, waiting for a verdict that would soon be written into the tragic annals of American pop culture. Inside the near-empty room, Stallone finally rose. He approached the defense table where Rick sat, head bowed. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice roughened by decades of hard living and harder losses, he spoke. "You could have been better, Rick," Stallone said quietly. "You had every chance. He gave you everything, and you threw it all away." Rick didn't look up. He only nodded once, the smallest movement, as if acknowledging a truth too heavy to bear. Without another word, Stallone turned and walked out into the glaring Nevada sun, leaving behind the echoes of a broken dream, a fractured legacy, and the fading memory of a man who had once believed that family was stronger than ambition. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces bore the heavy weight of their decision. Rick sat motionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the paneled walls, perhaps reliving every moment that had led him here. The judge, a stoic man with a reputation for fairness, asked the foreperson to rise. The courtroom held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Kevin Harrison, guilty of manslaughter in the first degree." A murmur passed through the crowd, not of surprise, but of sorrow. It wasn't the maximum charge the prosecution had sought, but it was enough. Enough to ensure that Rick would pay for what he had done, even if no sentence could ever undo the betrayal that shattered a family and an empire. The sentencing came swiftly. Rick was sentenced to 20 years in the Nevada Department of Corrections, eligible for parole after 12. He received the verdict without a visible reaction, the same numb acceptance that had blanketed him since the day he first confessed. As the gavel fell, sealing his fate, Rick's attorneys placed a hand on his shoulder in a small, futile gesture of comfort. He didn't flinch. Stallone had stayed until the very end, seated near the back, his presence a silent testament to a loyalty that transcended death. When the sentence was read, he simply bowed his head briefly, a quiet farewell to the man Richard had once been proud to call his son. Outside, the Las Vegas heat shimmered against the concrete as the news broke across every major network. CNN, Fox News, ABC, all carried the headline, "Pawn Stars Rick Harrison, sentenced in shocking family betrayal." It was not the ending anyone had envisioned for the once celebrated businessman. Social media erupted with commentary, most of it condemning, but a small portion tinged with pity, recognizing the profound tragedy not just in the crime itself, but in the broken spirit that had committed it. In the months that followed, the gold and silver pawn shop became a ghost of its former self. The tourist lines disappeared. Merchandise bearing Rick's image was quietly pulled from shelves. Even the History Channel, which had built a fortune off the Harrison family's antics and negotiations, issued a terse statement distancing itself entirely. The once iconic storefront, featured on countless episodes and millions of tourist photos, stood quiet and somber, its windows dusty, its parking lot half empty. Employees came and went in silence, their pride hollowed out, their loyalty eroded by betrayal too large to ignore. Corey Harrison, Rick's son, struggled to keep the business afloat, but the stain on the family name was too deep. Customers who once marveled at the relics inside now crossed the street to avoid the building altogether. Interviews Corey gave in the months after the trial were heavy with sadness. "We lost more than my grandfather," he said during one appearance on a local Vegas news channel. "We lost what we stood for." He spoke of the pawn shop not just as a business, but as a symbol of perseverance, grit, and trust, qualities that now seemed to crumble into dust with every passing day. Meanwhile, Rick adapted slowly to prison life at High Desert State Prison, a sprawling facility northwest of Las Vegas, where the desert wind blew ceaselessly against the razor wire fences. He was no celebrity here. Here, he was just another inmate, stripped of privilege, stripped of title, left alone with the crushing knowledge of his own failures. Reports from inside said Rick kept to himself, spending hours in the library reading history books, biographies, anything that allowed him to escape, even briefly, from the reality he had crafted with his own hands. He refused interviews, declined all television appearances, and rarely spoke to the outside world, save for brief letters to Corey, in which he expressed a muted, broken sort of regret, never quite asking for forgiveness, perhaps knowing it was beyond his reach. Stallone, for his part, returned quietly to his life in California, never publicly discussing his role in the investigation. When pressed by reporters during promotional events for his films, he would only shake his head and mutter, "Family's sacred. Some things you don't betray." It was all he ever said, and it was all that needed to be said. His friendship with Richard had been forged in hardship, tested by time, and ultimately honored in a way Rick could never understand. In the years that followed, Stallone would sometimes visit Las Vegas, slipping unnoticed through the city's bright chaos. He never visited the pawn shop again. Instead, he made a quiet pilgrimage once a year to the Southern Nevada Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Boulder City, where Richard Harrison was laid to rest under a simple stone, bearing his name, his Navy rank, and a few humble words: duty, honor, family. One particular afternoon, under a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost cruel, Stallone stood alone at Richard's grave, a small American flag tucked carefully into the soft earth. He stayed for a long time, lost in memories of battles fought and loyalty earned, of lessons that had meant something once, and of a brotherhood that had endured even after death. In the distance, the wind whispered across the desert scrub, carrying the heavy silence of things that might have been. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals erupted, new stories captured the public's imagination. Pawn stars faded from the airwaves, a relic of a different era. The gold and silver pawn shop eventually changed hands, bought quietly by an anonymous investor group who stripped it of its original branding and turned it into a tourist curiosity rather than a place of genuine commerce. The faces of the Harrison family disappeared from T-shirts and billboards, their names reduced to a tragic footnote in the crowded history of American pop culture. But for those who remembered, the story of Rick Harrison's downfall remained a bitter lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the quiet, corrosive power of resentment. It reminded them that even the strongest empires can fall from within, that even the brightest public personas can hide shadows too deep to be seen until it's far too late. It taught that loyalty is a bond too sacred to be manipulated, that honor cannot be bought or inherited. It must be earned, day by day, choice by choice. And in quiet moments, when the desert wind howled across the empty streets of Las Vegas at night, it carried with it the memory of an old man who once believed in family above all else, and the son who, in the end, forgot what it truly meant.